Few things are more badass than Spartans. Massive historical embellishments aside, Zack Snyder's 300 was probably the most masculine film ever made. I'm honestly shocked it didn't turn me gay. The queen of all sexy queens, played by Lena Headey, must have functioned as a perfect heterosexual counterweight or something. I don't know, I'm not a scientist. Before 300 hit theaters, but after the Xbox 360 launched, a PlayStation 2 game released about a Spartan so badass he makes the cast of 300 look like a gaming journalist. I'm talking about our boy Kratos in the incredibly epic action-adventure series, God of War. God of War was originally the brainchild of famous edgy game developer David Jaffe, who prior to God of War created the Twisted Metal series and the edgiest game of all, Mickey Mania. The premise of the series began as the story of a Spartan warrior named Kratos, who when defeated by a barbarian king, pledged his life to Ares in exchange for the strength to win the battle. Ares responded by giving Kratos the Blades of Chaos, the signature weapon of the series, which are two short swords attached to long chains which were cauterized to Kratos' forearms. Kratos uses the blades to kill the barbarian king and proceeds to perform missions for Ares, culminating in one which was intended to cut his ties to humanity. From here on out, there are going to be various spoilers for the story, so if you plan on playing through the series, this is going to be a tough watch, as the nature of the storytelling in the series builds upon each entry, and I will be talking about every single game in the series. What this means is that I'm going to have to spoil God of War 1 when talking about God of War 2, spoil 2 when I talk about 3, and so on, so I cannot promise you won't hear something which will hurt the experience if you want to play through them all blind. Ares sends Kratos to a village of Athena worshippers and has him kill everyone. What Kratos does not know is that his wife and daughter were in the village at the time, and in a ruthless, blind massacre, he kills the only two people who he loves. Kratos doesn't abandon his humanity though, he instead renounces his pledge to Ares and swears fealty to the other gods of Olympus, so that he may one day have a chance to get his revenge on Ares and stop the nightmares that he has about his family. After this deal is struck, the village oracle curses Kratos and the ashes of his family are bonded to his skin, giving him his pale white appearance, as well as his new title, the Ghost of Sparta. The majority of the game takes place 10 years after this happens, with Athena finally offering Kratos the mission he'd been waiting for: kill the god of war. Ares had been waging war in Athena's city, Athens, and gods are not allowed to declare war on each other, so Athena sends Kratos to find Pandora's box, which can give him the power to fight a god. By the end of the game, Kratos succeeds in his quest, grows to the size of a kaiju, and kills Ares, avenging his family, but the nightmare of their memory and what he did to them remain. Kratos ends the game jumping off a mountain to kill himself to escape these memories, but Athena saves him and puts him atop Mount Olympus to take the throne as the new god of war. She also gives him the Blades of Athena to replace his Blades of Chaos. We then get a little montage of Kratos being the god of war through history up until modern times, which is a bit that had to be retconned out for the rest of the series to happen, but it was a cool way to end the original game. The way you experience this epic story is in the form of a combo-based character action game with fixed camera angles where you have to move between arenas and fight various enemies, which spew out different colored orbs on death. Red orbs act as experience points, and you'll be earning them constantly from killing enemies and from treasure chests. Green orbs replenish your health and blue orbs replenish your magic. Both green and blue orbs are sometimes gained through combat, notably when execution moves are performed on specific enemy types, but they are much more frequently found in chests. Most of the chests in the game will blink between being green or blue and are often found alone, which forces the player to choose between refilling their magic or refilling their health. On higher difficulties, the game can be quite challenging, so this choice can certainly add a bit of a strategic element, particularly as you gain more powerful spells. Eventually, you also earn an extra melee weapon in the form of the Blade of Artemis, a heavy damage greatsword, but even after upgrading it a few times, I found the Blades of Chaos to be much more effective. The real problem with the combat in the first God of War game is almost entirely due to the encounter design aging poorly. No one encounter is particularly bad, but due to the limited enemy roster and dated game pacing, things begin to feel very repetitive. With that said, there is a fantastic puzzle-like boss fight against a massive armored minotaur, which was the absolute highlight of the game for me. Outside of the combat, the puzzles in the game are pretty solid. While there is a good deal of block pushing, which has become something of a game design meme, most of the puzzles are designed in ways which are simple enough to understand, but complex enough that solving them often requires thinking outside the box. The fixed camera angles do a great deal to assist this, as you know that you are seeing everything you're supposed to be seeing, without needing to manipulate your field of view. Also, the game will often lock you into a puzzle area, which prevents you from feeling like you have to backtrack in order to discover a missing element. These aspects combine to make the puzzle seem very focused, which help keep the pace moving forward much better than the combat and counter design. The final gameplay style in God of War is the platforming and climbing, which people often forget pioneered the locomotion which Sony eventually started putting in almost every one of their games. The style I'm referring to is the straightforward, difficult to fail, linear path climbing that you most famously see in the Uncharted games, but Sony has also used in Horizon Zero Dawn and Ghost of Tsushima. I wouldn't say it's overused in God of War, but if you've played any other Sony exclusive game where you scale a cliff face, you'll probably find the climbing in God of War very familiar. The gameplay in God of War was very tight and fluid, but it really wasn't doing a lot which games like Devil May Cry had not already done. What made God of War the commercial and critical darling it became was the incredible premise and execution. Greek mythology was a very underrepresented genre in video games at the time, and this setting, combined with Santa Monica Studios' masterful use of the PS2 hardware, which made it look competitive with the Xbox 360 games at the time, made God of War very enticing, even to people who had already moved on to the next generation of consoles. A huge part of this was their use of various graphical tricks to convey a sense of scale. An easy example of this is when you arrive at the road to Athens and see Ares on the battlefield. The Ares model isn't constructed of any more polygons than Kratos is, but he's presented in a way which makes him seem absolutely gigantic. On the sound front, actor Terrence C. Carson's booming voice gave Kratos an incredible degree of gravitas, which made him a compelling, intimidating character, even if he was a tad campy whenever he shouted for The original God of War game also pushed the envelope of adult content in the medium in the form of an interactive sex minigame. It's much more funny than it is sexy, but it did help remove a taboo in the medium. There aren't a lot of sex scenes in games which are super effective, but from a libertarian standpoint, the concept, not the political ideology, it's nice that the developers now have the freedom to add nudity or sex to their game if they want to. Overall, the original game holds up alright, and despite the repetitive encounter design, would be worth revisiting if you're interested in how the story began. However, it does also feel like a bare-bones proof of concept in the grand scheme of the series. Where that concept really became defined was in the follow-up game, God of War 2. The sequel refines the combat, level design, encounter design, and puzzles to an extraordinary degree over the original. It doesn't just feel like more God of War, it almost feels like the first real game in the series, making the original feel more like a prologue to the grander story ahead. It functions much in the same way that The Empire Strikes Back does to Star Wars. It's a satisfying story in its own right, but it also perfectly sets up the first trilogy's conclusion. The lead animator of the original game stepped up to the director's chair for the sequel. That animator's name is Cory Barlog, not Balrog, and he would go on to become one of the primary contributors to the story of the franchise going forward, as well as the director of the game will go in depth on at the end of the video. God of War 2 kicks off in the city of Rhodes, where Kratos, as the new God of War, is leading an invasion by the Spartan army. A giant colossus threatens Kratos' mission, so Zeus offers Kratos assistance in the form of the Blade of Olympus, which requires Kratos to drain his god powers into it in order to make it powerful enough to take the colossus down. Surprising nobody at all, this was a ruse. Zeus tricks Kratos into becoming mortal, at which point he kills him with the Blade of Olympus. This sends Kratos into his second canonical trip to the underworld for an extremely short segment. And it's here that our boy sets a world record for least amount of time spent dead after penetrating abdominal trauma. From here on out, Kratos goes on a quest to regain the power necessary to find the Sisters of Fate and force them to let him change his own. To do this, he makes allies out of the former enemies of the gods of Olympus, the Titans. Notably, the Titan of Earth, Gaia, who sets you up with a pretty sweet Pegasus. The Pegasus allows for a couple simple, on-rails Star Fox-like flight segments. They aren't mind-blowing, but they're definitely fun and unlike anything we saw in the first game. During this quest, Kratos moves through a limited number of distinct areas, which are each densely packed with puzzles, both environmental and otherwise. While I wouldn't call the God of War games Metroidvanias by any stretch, God of War 2 adopts that genre's trope of giving the player permanent upgrades, which then allow you to traverse previously impassable objects or solve previously unsolvable puzzles. The most significant item from a gameplay standpoint are the Wings of Icarus. Naturally, acquiring them involves tearing them right off Icarus's back and killing him. These then let you glide short distances and really open up the platforming segments. You also take the golden fleece off the body of the famous Argonaut, Jason. If you don't know much about classic pulp adventure films, this guy is the reason we have skeletons to fight in nearly every video game ever made. While Jason is dead when you find him, the game features boss encounters against two mythical heroes. Theseus, the hero of the Labyrinth who slayed the Minotaur, and Perseus, who in modern pop culture is the lead character in the Clash of the Titans films, which were a heavy inspiration on the God of War games. The original 80s one, at least. If anything, the more modern Sam Worthington movies were inspired by God of War. There's a solid boss fight against the soul of the barbarian king who Kratos offered his service to Ares to in order to defeat, and a very artistic and emotional scene in which Kratos fights a Spartan soldier who is also trying to change his fate. You also burn Prometheus early on, but it's sort of a good thing because you encounter him when he's in a pretty tough spot.
I'd luck to kill a seabird.
After you defeat all those foes, you come face to face with the Sisters of Fate themselves. The puzzle-like boss fights are quite engaging and feel like a good way to cap off the body of the game before the finale. When Kratos is able to defeat the sisters, he seizes the power of their loom and winds back time to the moment Zeus betrayed him. After a boss battle with Zeus and revenge close at hand, Athena intervenes and Kratos accidentally kills her. As she is dying, she reveals that Zeus is Kratos' father. Distraught after having killed the only god who was ever kind to him, Kratos winds time back again to the war between the gods and titans. Kratos then brings the titans into the present and the game ends with a fist-pumping cliffhanger, showing Kratos leading an army of titans against the gods of Olympus. Before and after the big cliffhanger was resolved, the series took some hops into the past for a few prequels. The first being one which I had honestly forgot about prior to researching this video, and is the only game in the series to release on a non-PlayStation platform. This JavaScript mobile game takes place before God of War 2, and is about Kratos being framed for murder, and then doing what he does, rampaging and killing gods until he gets his revenge. I wasn't able to get an emulated version of this game working properly, so I don't really have any first-hand experience with it, but this came from an era where mobile games had not really come into their own, so I don't imagine it's one that you absolutely need to play, although I can't really speak to it. If you can find an old JavaScript phone and find a copy of God of War Betrayal, go for it, but I honestly don't think you're going to be missing a whole lot. In 2008, which might have been the peak of the battle between the PlayStation Portable and the Nintendo DS, Ready at Dawn released the first of two PSP God of War games, Chains of Olympus. If the name Ready at Dawn sounds familiar, it's because they were the studio who made The Order 1886, which was famous for being a boring, linear, generic third-person shooter, which also had the best console visuals of its time, and incredible lore, which will probably never be revisited because the game did not sell very well. They've since moved on to making a virtual reality series called Lone Echo for Oculus, making them a studio which is evolving like a Pokemon from a tech standpoint. But even when they're making portable console games, their ability to utilize technology was incredibly impressive. The PlayStation Portable was far less powerful than a PS2, but Ready at Dawn was able to make Chains of Olympus look comparable to the original PS2 games. They also managed to adapt the game to PSP's more limited control scheme by having the player hold the L and R buttons to essentially shift the left stick to a dodge function, as the PSP did not have a right stick. The story in Chains of Olympus functions mostly as a workhorse to get you between God of War gameplay set pieces. It's not bad exactly, but it doesn't really move the needle in any significant way. It's set before the events of the original game, after the death of Kratos' family, and in the years when he was serving as a warrior for the gods, and opens with him defending the city of Attica from a Persian invasion. After a fight with a basilisk, which uses every trick in the book to make this PSP game seem like a large-scale cinematic action game, with mostly successful results, the sun falls out of the sky. This causes the gods to fall asleep, leaving Kratos with the task of solving the mystery and waking his bosses up. Kratos moves through the city of Marathon, shrouded in the dream fog of Morpheus, the chariot of Helios, the underworld, and the river Styx, where you face off against the ferryman Charon, who is such a Charon that he throws you into Tartarus, forcing Kratos to wake up the Titan Atlas to get out. Kratos then ends up at the Temple of Persephone, where she offers him a deal to be with his dead daughter Calliope on the plains of Elysium. The thing is, the deal is a trick. Because Persephone was so pissed that she had an arranged marriage with Hades, she plans to use Atlas to destroy the pillar which supports the world, and put an end to all of existence, not only including Olympus and Earth, but the underworld and Elysium as well. This obviously causes Kratos a problem, as if Elysium is destroyed, his daughter will be along with it, so there's a pretty touching scene where Kratos has to leave Calliope. It isn't milked or overdramatic, you just get to tap circle to pull away from your daughter as she struggles to hold on. Kratos' heart of gold when it comes to his children is explored in more detail in the most recent game, but this moment is kind of poignant if you go back to it after you've played that one. Once you've left your daughter and earned the Deadbeat Dad trophy, you fight Persephone, then kill two birds with one stone by trapping Atlas under the world, forcing him to hold it up. No apocalypse, no rampaging titan, no more crazy wife of Hades, and no more happy ending with daughter Calliope, but at least she's safe on the plains of Elysium. The story is solid enough, but it's pretty basic save for the touching moment with Calliope. However, the dungeons, puzzles, and combat scenarios with Ready at Dawn built for Chains of Olympus are quite solid, and it felt too good to be true for a PSP game. The gameplay feels fluid and the Blades of Chaos feel as good as they did on the PS2 games, and you also get a shield which has a cool parrying mechanic that functions similarly to the Golden Fleece in God of War 2. The encounters evolve well enough, but there are definitely a few moments when the kill room design structure can make the game feel a bit repetitive. This honestly could have been helped by something as simple as cutting down the amount of enemy waves. That being said, the combat is great, so it's not entirely a bad thing. Ready at Dawn later ported the game to PS3 in the form of the Origins collection, which is what this footage is pulled from. Similar to Bluepoint's PS3 ports of the original two games, the two games in this collection run at 1080p, 60 frames a second, and even support stereoscopic 3D, if you happen to have a 3D TV, and a PS3 because Sony can't seem to figure out backward compatibility for anything prior to PS4. Ready at Dawn followed up their portable prequel to the original God of War with a portable prequel to God of War 2 called Ghost of Sparta. Ghost of Sparta is a much better game than Chains of Olympus and offers a few really unique gameplay elements. Early on, you earn the ability to modify the Blades of Athena with an ability called Thera's Bane, which sets them on fire. The Thera's Bane ability is tied to a new bar which automatically recharges over time. You hold one of the R buttons and the blades set ablaze, which let you do damage through enemy armor. If you have this activated at the end of a combo, the power strike will add a fuse to the enemy, which explodes a few moments later, doing heavy damage and staggering them. This allows you to do some really cool things with crowd control. You're encouraged to carefully manage the Thera's Bane meter and activate the ability in a way which keeps the maximum amount of enemies lit up with the fuses at all times. You also have a few cool new magic abilities like a light orb which pulls health power-ups from enemies, a horn which can freeze enemies, and a pretty standard lightning beam attack. The secondary weapon you earn is the Arms of Sparta, which is the traditional shield and spear of a Spartan warrior. As a melee weapon, the arms are okay. They don't compare to the Blades of Athena, but they aren't totally useless. Where they really shine is that they double as a ranged weapon, letting you throw an unlimited amount of spears at distant enemies. Like Chains of Olympus, the story in Ghost of Sparta is pretty simple and primarily revolves around Kratos' brother Deimos. When Kratos and Deimos were kids, Ares and Athena attacked their village and kidnapped Deimos. They did this because of a prophecy that a marked warrior would be the downfall of Olympus, and Deimos, even as a child, had the red marks which are seen around Kratos' body. The difference is, for Deimos they were birthmarks, and Kratos eventually gets them as tattoos in order to honor his brother. The premise is definitely sufficient to get Kratos on an adventure to seek answers, but it does seem to create a bit of a question in the series canon. That being, if Kratos witnessed Ares kidnap and presumably kill his brother, why would it take him until the events of God of War 1 to start hating Ares? There's also an awkward moment later in the game where Kratos realizes that Athena was involved in his brother's kidnapping, which is played as a big reveal, but is painfully obvious during the first flashback.
Forgive me. Forgive me.
Story awkwardness aside, the journey does see you fighting a massive Scylla at the Temple of Poseidon, which is a pretty cool segment. You also get to visit Kratos' homeland of Sparta, where what is probably the most over-the-top sex minigame in the entire franchise happens. You then get a trip to the sunken city of Atlantis, a showdown with Deimos in the realm of Thanatos, and finally a fight with Thanatos himself at the Suicide Bluffs from the original game. The final boss fight is particularly cool because it has you teaming up with Deimos and maps him to a single button. This brother button is a concept which is greatly expanded upon in the most recent God of War game, but don't worry, we will be talking about that one later. Where Ghost of Sparta really impresses is that its technical execution is really incredible considering its roots as a PSP game. The art direction is some of the best in the series, the camera work and lighting are stunning, and in the PS3 remaster, the performance is really solid, barring the occasional frame dips when the action really heats up. I did also notice some screen tearing on my monitor as well, but I'm not sure if that's just the result of me running a PS3 through a capture card and into a computer monitor instead of just directly into a TV. The pacing of the game is pretty good too, with the game moving you from area to area in roughly 5 to 10 minute intervals, which really suits the original version's portable format. Sadly, a few areas of the game do fall victim to a bit of repetitive encounter design. Had a few enemy waves been removed here or there, the game may have lost an hour or so of playtime, but would be a bit more comfortable to revisit. One enemy type in particular was very annoying, as they have a grab attack which was quite hard to avoid, and you fight a lot of them in the last few areas. However, despite all these issues, Ghost of Sparta is a fantastic spin-off which should definitely not be skipped by fans of the series. It is here that we reach the series' point of hubris. God of War Ascension happened at the very end of the PlayStation 3 lifecycle and is absolutely the black sheep of the franchise, due in no small part to the fact that it was released after God of War 3. which we will be talking about next, don't worry. Ascension was primarily set to be the game which expanded the franchise into multiplayer, but Santa Monica Studios also decided to add a campaign, which followed Kratos in the events immediately following the breaking of his oath to Ares. He is captured and imprisoned by the Furies, and that's Furies, not furries, so don't worry, this game isn't absolutely horrifying. Kratos has to free himself from the Furies and break Ares' power over him so that he may embark on the quest of the original trilogy as well as the PSP spin-offs. The twist ending of Ascension is that when Kratos does this, the memories of killing his own family begin to haunt him. From a narrative standpoint, Ascension is a very arbitrary prequel, as it doesn't really add anything at all to the story, which wasn't easily inferred by the other games in the series. It really seems like the Sony higher-ups just said, make the next God of War game, and instead of giving them the time to take the story forward in a new direction, they went with what felt like a lot of retread. It also doesn't help that the story is structured in a very weird way, which makes some of the gameplay make no sense at all. You begin the game fighting one of the Furies through their prison, and then you play through a flashback within a prequel which takes place 3 weeks earlier. You then snap back to Ascension's present day to fight another Fury before a flashback which takes place 2 weeks earlier than Ascension's present, before ending the game in Ascension's present, which takes place 10 years before the original game.
Oh no, I've gone cross-eyed.
The thing which makes that confusion even weirder is that during the flashbacks you gain abilities and skills which you did not have in the timeline you flashback from. It's like the game director watched Pulp Fiction and decided that non-linear story structure was cool, but didn't stop to think about what medium he was telling the story in. There's an argument to be made that for a spin-off story having this much effort put behind it is commendable, as it's the kind of tale that you'd expect to see in something like a prequel comic, but it's also an underwhelming way to follow up God of War 3's epic trilogy finale. The production values are great and incredibly ambitious, but in a weird way it's also the game which has aged most poorly. God of War Ascension is only available on PlayStation 3 and it targets 30 frames a second, which it is sometimes exceeding as it appears to be unlocked, however very often performance dips below 30. Ascension really crystallized my hypothesis that God of War games are intended to run on the generation after they release. The God of War games have always shot for the moon technically, so the definitive version of each of these games are their high-performance remasters, or in the sake of the most recent God of War playing it on a PS5, but Ascension remains to this day a beautifully designed but horribly performing PlayStation 3 title. The very frequent use of screen shaking effects don't do the 30 frames a second target any favors either. Where the technical aspects of this game really shine are during the large-scale boss fights. The sense of scale on display during the initial fight against the Hecatoncheires or the climactic battle against a Kraken are pretty crazy to see and make Ascension worth playing if you're a fan of the series, just don't be expecting the story to really move the needle for you. Ascension also delivers on the gameplay front, with the combat being very intense and the puzzles being very interesting as well. The Blades of Chaos are your only primary weapon in this entry, but they have 3 distinct forms: Fire, Ice, Lightning, and Hades. Each of these forms are associated with a unique spell, as well as a very powerful attack which can be unleashed when your rage meter fills up enough. The Fire form sets the same fuse on an enemy which was featured in Ghost of Sparta, and the Hades form unleashes some dead souls similar to the Hades spell in the original game. The Lightning form creates a damage over time stun, and the Ice form, you guessed it, freezes enemies. However, I didn't find the Lightning form did very much damage, and for some reason the Freeze form didn't really allow me to effectively shatter enemies with the Power Strike, so most often I would stick to the Fire form and the Hades form. In fact, if I have any issue with the combat in Ascension, it's that the enemies appear to have too many defensive moves. I'm fine with enemies being difficult, but few things bother me in a game more than when a powerful enemy simply cannot be damaged. There's a heavy elemental enemy which enters this invulnerable state at times, and the natural instinct would be to switch to the reciprocal element in order to do damage, but this doesn't happen. Instead, you just have to dodge around him and wait until you're allowed to do damage again. It's not game-breaking, but it is a bit on the frustrating side. However, the executions in combat are pretty insane, with some locking you into a kinetic close combat minigame, and others just being spectacularly animated. The puzzles can be visually stunning at times as well, with the Amulet of Ouroboros working kind of like the Eye of Agamotto from Doctor Strange.
Dormammu, I've come to bargain.
Turning specific environmental elements back in time in order to solve puzzles is pretty cool, both from a presentation standpoint as well as functionally. Every so often you'll have to turn time back partially, leaving a half-formed structure to create a platforming path. This doesn't really get old at any point, and a few of the time-shifting puzzles are difficult, but rarely to the point of frustration. The other skill unique to this game are the shadow clone things you can create, which can do things like keep a lever held for Kratos, which is also used in some clever ways during puzzles. The major highlight of the game for me was absolutely that final battle against the Kraken. It's crazy to think that Santa Monica Studios was able to achieve that on a PS3. I don't necessarily think it's worth tracking down a copy specifically for that one battle, but if you find yourself wanting to be a completionist, there is a treat waiting for you at the end of Ascension. It's just a bit weird that it's such an aesthetic treat coming from hardware so dated. Also worth noting, this game does feature Kratos Spartan kicking King Leonidas himself.
This is Sparta!
Now that we've covered all the numerous prequels and side stories, it's time to get back on track with the ending of the original God of War trilogy, God of War 3. While most trilogies will peak with their second chapter, God of War 3 truly feels like the perfect form of the series' original gameplay style. The combat, puzzles, and platforming are all fundamentally the same as they were in the original game, but polished to a mirror sheen. The story picks up immediately where God of War 2 left off. Kratos is riding Gaia's back up Mount Olympus, leading an army of titans. The opening moments of God of War 3 are some of the most explosive and epic of any game ever made. This is due in part to it being a visually impressive spectacle, which was pushing the PlayStation 3 hardware pretty hard, and looks incredible on modern hardware as well, with the footage you're seeing being the PlayStation 4 remaster running on a PlayStation 5. But it's equally a product of the fact that the sequence has the full narrative weight of God of War 2, pushing it to be an epic moment in the story. Kratos had defeated Zeus, and before he was able to deliver the killing blow, he accidentally killed Athena, which allowed Zeus to escape. Now the story is back, rocketing towards Kratos taking another shot at his revenge. Standing in his way are Poseidon, Hades, Helios, Hermes, and another son of Zeus, Hercules himself. The Poseidon battle takes place over the course of that incredible intro mission, and ends with one of the most cinematic uses of a control interface outside of a Kojima game. The player takes Poseidon's point of view as Kratos is beating the living hell out of him, and ends with an atypical control prompt for a QuickTime event, clicking both analog sticks, which causes Kratos to give Poseidon the old hot Pedro. It's not just the Poseidon one either, all the boss executions in this game are sights to behold. It's clear that game director Stig Asmussen was flexing his inner horror movie director on this one. Every time you kill a boss, it's like a scene from a Saw movie with close attention paid to details like what the skin of a neck would look like if a head were being torn off by a god-powered man's bare hands. After the intro, the pace of the story kicks down a few gears, so it doesn't play out like the game-long battle which it seemed like it was going to. After the aforementioned Poseidon kill, Kratos falls off of Gaia, who refuses to help him incidentally, more on that later, and finds himself dead for the third time in as many mainline games. The spirit of Athena then gives him the Blades of Exile, which will be the primary weapon for the rest of the game, and Kratos presses forward into the underworld to escape it yet again. I don't know why Hades thinks he's able to hold Kratos after 2 failed attempts to, but this time he decides to keep the gate of the underworld himself, and, well... When Kratos returns to the land of the living, he sees Gaia struggling to hold herself at the edge of a mountain, and Kratos isn't a fan of being betrayed, so in addition to fighting all the remaining gods of Olympus, he sort of declares war on what's left of the Titans too. Killing Poseidon has caused the oceans to rise, and when Kratos kills the third god of the game, Helios, the world plunges into darkness. It's really cool to see that Kratos' actions are having tangible consequences on the world, and really makes you think about the morality of what Kratos is doing here, as his quest is causing a calamity and countless innocent people are probably dying. You continue through Olympus, take on the messenger god Hermes in a foot race, at which point you kill him and unleash a plague upon what remains of Greece. Next you reach an arena where Hera sics Hercules on you for a quick battle of the sons of Zeus. Naturally you brutally murder Hercules as well. After the battle with Hercules, you come across a bridge which you can't yet cross, and luckily for Kratos, it happens to be right in front of the chamber of Aphrodite. After a quick romp with the goddess of love herself, you visit her husband Hephaestus, who sends you to get an item from Kronos, who naturally you have to kill. Hephaestus then builds you the item you need to cross the bridge, then tries to kill you in fear that your quest will result in the death of his daughter. The daughter in question is Pandora, and just like in the original game, her box is the key to gaining the power Kratos needs to kill Zeus. Once you locate Pandora, you're essentially with her for the rest of the game. From a gameplay standpoint, this doesn't radically alter things, but we start to see glimpses of the Kratos which will take center stage in the new games, the loving father figure. You guide her through Daedalus's labyrinth before arriving at the chamber containing Pandora's box, which is guarded by the flames of Olympus. Pandora can neutralize the flame, but it will be at the cost of her own life, at which point Kratos is willing to give up his mission in order to save this girl, because she reminds him of his daughter Calliope. After a cool boss fight with Zeus on a 2D plane, Pandora runs for the box and Kratos tries to stop her. It's only when Zeus taunts Kratos, saying that he shouldn't fail her the way he failed his own family, that Kratos becomes enraged and unconsciously lets go of Pandora in order to defeat Zeus. Pandora consumes the flames of Olympus, Kratos opens the box and finds nothing. Kratos is not given any new power, so he goes to take on Zeus as he is, thinking that Pandora sacrificed her life for nothing. In the middle of the second phase against Zeus, Gaia shows up again, who is apparently not dead, and the final phase of the fight happens inside her chest. When you defeat Zeus, Kratos uses the Blade of Olympus to stab Zeus through Gaia's heart, killing both of them in the process. Kratos then wakes up on Olympus and is attacked by the spirit of Zeus, who sends Kratos into a dark, purgatory-like dimension. When you get near the end, Kratos hears the voice of Pandora, who calls him toward a small light in the darkness. She then appears to him in a vision, telling him that
hope is what makes us strong. It is why we are here. It is what we fight with when all else is lost.
Kratos then snaps out of the purgatory and in a first-person sequence fights the spirit of Zeus. The last encounter of the trilogy has you swinging the blades of exile through the eyes of Kratos and ends with you beating a corporeal Zeus to death with your bare hands. It turns out that way back in the original game, Kratos didn't actually use the evil that was inside Pandora's box to kill Ares, but the hope which Athena also placed in there. Dark, brooding, angry Kratos held the power of hope within him through the entire trilogy. The spirit of Athena shows up and demands that Kratos give her the power of hope so that she may use it to rule over mankind as their god. Kratos picks up the Blade of Olympus, and while it seems like he's going to try to kill Athena's spirit with it, instead he stabs himself, releasing the power of hope for all the world. After the credits, we see that Kratos' body is gone, with no sign of how he survived or where he escaped to. God of War 3 was incredible. It really felt like the culmination of everything the series was working towards from both a narrative and a gameplay standpoint. You begin the game with the Icarus wings and the Golden Fleece in tow, so while, like in God of War 2, Kratos gets conveniently de-leveled early on in the story, you don't have to waste a lot of time retrieving items which you earned in previous games. You're granted some new abilities which affect gameplay in interesting ways, like the Head of Helios, which lets you light dark paths and blind enemies, and the Boots of Hermes, which lets you run up specific walls and charge into enemies. All of the other items you receive are weapons, and each have a spell attached to them. They all control like variations of the Blade of Exile, but they are unique enough and do specific types of damage, so switching to them is often very worthwhile. Particularly switching to the Nemean Cestus, which you acquire from Hercules in order to break shields and armor. God of War 3 doesn't reinvent the wheel for the series, but it certainly feels like a perfect way to cap off the trilogy, and it runs beautifully in the PS4 remaster. It's one of the shortest games in the series, but it also feels like it's got the best pacing. There were no moments in God of War 3 where I felt like the story was spinning its wheels or that the encounter design was getting tedious, nor did I feel like it was over too soon. So while there is an argument to be made for $60 being too much for a 10-hour game, at least at launch, it managed to provide the most satisfying gameplay experience in the whole series, so it's really tough to complain. Ascension certainly had a tough act to follow, which is part of what made it feel underwhelming in comparison to God of War 3, but in 2018, Santa Monica Studio finally figured out how to bring God of War back in a satisfying way. 2018's God of War, which because it shares the exact same title as the original PS2 game I will henceforth refer to as Dad of Boy, takes the series to a new land with a new mythology. The new era of the series leaves the Greek setting behind in favor of Norse mythology. Sadly, original voice actor Terrence C. Carson was also left behind. Apparently, Santa Monica Studio wanted one actor for both voice and motion capture, so they went with the much larger, taller Stargate SG-1 actor, Christopher Judge. I feel bad for Carson as he really made Kratos his own over the years, and according to an interview he gave to Vlad TV on YouTube, he wasn't even notified that this recast was happening. He just found out one day that there was a new God of War game happening and that he wasn't going to be in it. That really sucks and reminds me of the weirdness around Kojima recasting David Hayter with Kiefer Sutherland for Metal Gear Solid 5 in a similarly callous manner, but I'd be lying if I didn't admit that Christopher Judge absolutely kills it in the role of Kratos. We get our first glimpse of Judge's fully bearded, older looking Kratos in the opening moment of the game, chopping down a tree which has a golden palm print on it with a beautiful battle axe. Kratos is planning to use this tree for a funeral pyre for a Norse woman named Faye, who it turns out was Kratos' new wife, who died shortly before this game began. Kratos is not alone, however, as he and Faye's son Atreus is still with Kratos and accompanies him through most of the game, hence Data Boy being the loving pet name many use for this game. The presentation of this game is pretty spectacular, and other than the menus or the map screen, every moment of the game is presented as one extended long take. If you've ever seen the film Children of Men, there are a few sequences in that film which use a similar technique, and more recently, 1917 attempts to do the same thing through the entire length of the film. Obviously, the effect is much easier to achieve in a game than in a live-action film, but it's still impressive to see. Funny enough, some of the new gameplay systems are at odds with this presentation, though. In addition to the new, tight, over-the-shoulder camera, Santa Monica also added a bunch of looter elements. Kratos can be kitted out with chest, wrist, and waist armor, which you can augment with various gems, all of which can be upgraded using a currency called Hack Silver, in addition to numerous item-specific upgrade materials. While this does add some depth to the replay value, giving the player an excuse to grind out some endgame content and get better gear, it also forces the player into menus for a lot more micromanaging than is necessary for this type of game. The good news is there are no microtransactions in this game, so Santa Monica Studio didn't throw this stuff in to milk players out of money for legendary upgrade gems or anything like that. It just adds a level of complexity to the game system which might seem intimidating to some. I played my fair share of role-playing games, so I was fine with it, but considering the game is primarily focused on being a cinematic character action game, part of me wonders if it would flow more organically with this loot system removed. At the very least, it would have helped preserve the long take presentation style, as you wouldn't constantly be having to break the long take by going into a menu. That said, the gear hunt, as well as the ultra-difficult Valkyrie fights, do provide a fair amount of viable endgame content, so if you feel like getting 30 hours out of this game rather than the default 20 or so, there are things you can do to get more bang for your buck. Luckily, even if you do want to sprint toward the end of the story, which is what I did on the playthrough you're seeing in this footage, that is absolutely an option, and the story, gameplay, and presentation are all very satisfying in their own right. The new camera certainly makes the action look intense and cinematic, although it does create a couple of issues as well. You're able to focus on a specific target, which combined with the R1, R2 attack buttons, make this game feel a lot more like a Souls game than any of the other games in the series. Sadly, the camera is always very close up, which isn't quite as functional as the wider field of view you get in the From Software games. On the higher difficulties, this game is quite challenging, but part of that challenge comes from not being able to see enough of the enemies during the more intense encounters. Santa Monica Studios does give you a radial danger compass around Kratos, so your situational awareness isn't absolutely zero, but the wide, fixed cameras of the original game in the series function much more effectively in this type of action game. And yes, despite the new camera and axe weapon, this is still very much a God of War game. The combos, blocking, parrying, and dodge systems are all much along the lines of the other games in the series. The biggest change to the combat, other than jumping being removed, is that you now have 2 ways to defeat each enemy. Enemies now have visible health bars in addition to stun bars which fill as you inflict certain types of damage. At any point in combat, you can unequip the Leviathan axe or throw it at any enemy. With the axe gone, Kratos will use his fists as well as a spiral retracting Spartan shield. These attacks will fill up the enemy's stun bar and can ready them for an execution move. The random button prompt failable execution minigames are gone, but this is a pretty welcome change. As you know for certain, an execution grapple will result in an instant kill or an opportunity to do more damage. The other means by which to do heavy stun damage is to use the boy button. During puzzles or exploration, you can hit the square button to command Atreus to perform an action, but in combat, square gets Atreus to fire arrows at whichever enemy the camera is looking at. Atreus' positioning does matter, but the AI is actually pretty good at keeping him in areas where he'll be useful. As skills open up, Atreus will even start grappling and stabbing enemies which are near him. He functions a lot like a more advanced version of Ellie in the original Last of Us game, which was clearly an inspiration on this game. The biggest difference is that instead of being a passive assistant during combat and an immersion breaker during stealth, Atreus is an extension of the player's arsenal, which can be extremely helpful. The final primary element to the combat are the runic attacks, which replace the magic system of the previous games. On the Leviathan axe, you can equip a light runic attack and a heavy runic attack, which do heavy damage, elemental ice damage, and are mediated by individual cooldown meters. So no hunting for mana. The Leviathan axe also functions critically in the game's puzzles, which frequently require throwing the axe at pressure points to move objects, or at gears to freeze machinery with its ice magic properties. Pressing triangle will recall the axe, which looks very similar to how Thor wields Mjolnir in the Marvel films. The sound design is nothing short of masterful here. The whirling crescendo and satisfying thump sound really helped sell the effect and make Kratos' new weapon feel as distinct as the Blades of Chaos, Athena, and Exile did. It was an incredible choice, and that sound designer deserves a raise. I don't care what he's being paid, he needs more.
Wow.
Go.
Oh. What happened here?
To discuss any of the other gameplay elements, we need to get into the story, and while I did that one blanket spoiler warning at the beginning of the video, I assume you're watching a historical analysis because you've played the games and want to reminisce, or you're curious about the series' history. But God of War 2018 is still relatively new, runs like butter on the PlayStation 5, and is even included on that platform with the PlayStation Plus subscription, so I get that some people may want to play the beginning of this new, presumed trilogy without being spoiled on the story. So like, subscribe, share, do the YouTube things, and come back when you're done for the rest of the analysis and the gripping conclusion. If you've played the game before or don't care about spoilers, let's get into this. After cremating his wife, Kratos takes Atreus on a hunting trip, during which they fight a troll and Kratos learns that Atreus is not ready for the journey to the highest point in all the realms, which is where Faye requested her ashes be scattered. When they arrive back at home, a stranger comes to the door, who despite his scrawny, meth head-like appearance, is clearly a Norse god because he's able to throw down with Kratos without breaking a sweat or feeling any pain. Kratos snaps the stranger's neck and decides to take the underprepared Atreus on his quest, as their hidden valley is clearly within the sights of the Norse gods, and it wouldn't be safe to leave him there alone. The father-son duo presses forward and meets a witch in the forest, who hides the pair from the gods with a protection rune, and points them towards the Bifrost Gate, which they use to travel to Alfheim, where they need to retrieve a magic light in order to progress. There's a really badass sequence here where Kratos is caught in a vision, and when he rejoins his son, the little bastard has stacked up an extremely respectable pile of bodies. As you maybe would expect Kratos' son would be able to. Atreus isn't aware of his demigod heritage at this point, and the internal struggle is causing him to have coughing fits for reasons. I've got to say that wasn't explained super well, but the ability to kill dozens of dark elves at age 10 with no assistance should have probably been a clue. When Kratos gets back with the Light of Alfheim, he enchants Atreus' bow, which can let you fire magic light arrows. These arrows open up some Metroidvania-style obstacles in the form of crystals, which can be shot to construct light bridges. Kratos uses the Light of Alfheim to clear the smoke which was blocking their path up the mountain. During the climb, the pair are attacked by a dragon, and after an awesome boss fight, Atreus acquires the ability to fire lightning arrows as well. When you reach the top of the mountain, you overhear the stranger, who turns out to be the god Balder, as well as the two sons of Thor interrogating a man named Mimir. Turns out Mimir has been fused into a tree, but is a wealth of knowledge and stands to be very helpful, so naturally, Kratos chops off his head and brings him to the witch for reanimation. And it turns out the witch is the goddess Freya, who is also Balder's mother. And the plot begins to thicken up really nicely, with Mimir's resurrected head acting as something of a second sidekick for the rest of the game. Mimir informs Kratos and Atreus that the highest point in all the realms isn't in Midgard but in Jotunheim, and therefore he guides the group to gather all the items they'll need to open the last portal to Jotunheim. Shortly into this quest, they're ambushed by the sons of Thor, Magni and Modi, with whom there is a pretty awesome boss fight. Kratos kills Magni, Modi flees, and Atreus falls horribly ill. Kratos takes Atreus to Freya, who says that she can save him, but not without a stone which can only be found in Helheim. Apparently, Norse hell is extremely cold rather than a fiery inferno, and the ice-powered Leviathan axe would essentially be useless against the enemies there. So Kratos travels back to his house, accompanied by a vision of Athena, and fans of the series have a pretty damn good idea of what he's heading to retrieve: the fire-powered Blades of Chaos. And yes, I understand that this is a bit of a retcon, as Kratos hasn't had the Blades of Chaos since the end of God of War 1 in the timeline. The last blades which were tied to the chains of Olympus were the Blades of Exile, but that is a bit of a nitpick. It just kind of stands out if you devour 7 games in the series back-to-back over the span of a month. It's also kind of a shame that while the music cue of Kratos' new theme playing is cool, I can't help but think that it was a missed opportunity to reintroduce the musical theme from the original games. When you get to let the chains loose, the game really starts to echo the original games much more strongly. It's actually kind of clever that after all the secondary weapons in the old games felt truly secondary to the blades, this game gets you used to a new weapon for the whole first half of the game before even letting you touch the blades. It helps you value both of the main weapons, and you might even find yourself swapping to fists and shields voluntarily to get those stun kills, so this game really feels like the arsenal is balanced. The Blades of Chaos also give you 2 additional runic attacks, as well as a brand new upgrade tree specifically for them. The tactical possibilities and even necessities which are created by having 2 elemental damage weapons and a stun damage weapon really help the combat in this game shine. While I don't think it has anywhere near the flexibility or precision of a From Software game or Devil May Cry 5, it all feels very good due to the impressive camera work and forgiving combo system. With the blades in tow, Kratos heads off to Helheim and is able to use the blades to capture the winds of hell for use in puzzles going forward, which is basically a transferable charge which can be carried for a maximum of 10 seconds. Kratos returns to Midgard, retrieves the boy, and tells him the truth. You then make your way back up the mountain, only for Baldur to interrupt and destroy the gate to Jotunheim. The next segments of the game slow down quite a bit and have you returning to Helheim, which feels like a bit of retread, but does end with a cool sequence on a flying ship, as well as some visions of Zeus, but from a narrative standpoint it also sees Atreus turning into a bit of a dick. Granted, it would make sense that a 10-year-old would have an ego trip if he found out that he was a god, but considering how quickly he appears to gain maturity and perspective, it feels like a bit of an unnecessary character detour. When you do get back to Midgard, the trio gets hot on the trail of the benevolent god of war Tyr, who is both well loved by men as well as the giants. Tyr has a hidden temple which contains a path to Jotunheim. Our heroes go to it, solve some puzzles, and get the endgame in sight before Baldur attacks yet again. This final boss fight is pretty intense and sees you fighting both Baldur as well as Freya controlling a giant earth golem of sorts, as she desperately wants to save her son. Atreus' mistletoe pricks Baldur, breaking his invulnerability, and at the end of the battle, Baldur goes to his mother and attempts to strangle her, at which point Kratos does what he does best.
Why do you even care? You could have walked away.
The Cyberians here must be better than this.
Freya ends the game vowing revenge on Kratos, and I can only imagine Odin and Thor will be none too pleased when they find out their sons and brother have been killed, but that's a story for another game. Kratos and Atreus travel to Jotunheim where they find painted murals of Faye as well as themselves, which show the events of the game. Faye knew that their journey was going to happen the way it did because she was the last of the giants. And her son Atreus, who is the son of a god and a giant, sees his name his mother referred to him as written on the wall: Loki. Kratos sees a final mural which Atreus, or Loki, doesn't see, and it appears to show Kratos' death. Considering all the other images occurred, it won't surprise me if the next game is Kratos' final starring role, and this trilogy ends with us playing as Loki to avenge his parents. Kratos and Atreus scatter the ashes and the game ends, giving the player the option to pursue endgame content, while also making all the series fans eagerly anticipate the next entry. That brings us up to present with the series, with the only solid information on the sequel to Data Boy being a teaser trailer which showed a title, God of War Ragnarok, and a 2021 release date, which I would bet my remaining leg is absolutely not happening. If you want to dig into the series and play all the games I've talked about in this video, there's good news and bad news on that front. The good news is you've got 7 proper games in an epic series to play without having to wait for new releases or updates. They're all just available and ready to go. The bad news is, while Sony has thankfully made PS5 compatible with PS4 games, their conservation efforts are piss poor overall, and the vast majority of the series exists on PS3. The only console which plays PlayStation 3 games is a PlayStation 3. You can find PS3s easily enough, and it's an HDMI-equipped system, so getting it working on a modern TV isn't a problem, but when making this video I noticed something Sony has done which blew my mind. At least in Canada, it's impossible to buy PlayStation 3 games on the PlayStation Store. That includes accessing the store from the website, the mobile app, and even a PS3 console itself. So at this point, the only way which you can play God of War 1, 2, Chains of Olympus, Ghosts of Sparta, and Ascension is by tracking down a physical disc on either PS3 or the respective game's PS2 or PSP versions where applicable. Luckily, God of War 3 was remastered for PS4, so it, along with Data Boy, is playable on all modern PlayStation hardware, but I can't help but find it strange that the final chapter of a trilogy is the only one which can be easily accessed by new players. I don't know if Sony wants players to forget about the Greek mythology era of God of War intentionally, as I can't imagine it'd be tough to release a full collection on PS4 or PS5, but it seems like they're leaving buckets of money on the table by not doing so. With the pending release of Days Gone on PC and the announcement that more PlayStation exclusives are coming, the going rumor is that God of War 2018 is next, which I'm super excited for, but it'd be incredible if Sony would get someone to port all the old games over as well. because as much as God of War 2018 is a fresh entry in the series, it is still absolutely a sequel, with a big reveal in the middle of the game being predicated on the fact that Athena and the Blades of Chaos are things that you're aware of. So not being able to play the majority of the games which feature the Blades or Athena in modern day is pretty strange. God of War is one of those series which really nails a lot of what it's trying to do in ways which work. I don't think the games hit the highs of the Devil May Cry series or even Bayonetta when it comes to fixed camera character action, nor do I think God of War 2018 does as well as From Software's catalog when it comes to challenging precision combat with lock targeting, but the premise, story, characters, and presentation all come together to create something really incredible. You won't catch me ever calling God of War's gameplay unique overall, but there is certainly something to taking ideas and executing them at a high standard, which this series absolutely does. If you're willing to jump through the hoops necessary to play the entire series, there is a lot of good waiting for you in that back catalog, but Sony, if you're listening to me, port these games to PS4 and PC. Leaving them stranded on discontinued hardware with no digital purchase option is madness. But if you don't want to play God of War and you still want to do something with Greek mythology, play Hades. Hades rocks.